Welcome back to the Between Breaths podcast. I'm Jacko, your host, and in today's episode, this is part 2 of a series on brain injuries, concussion and breathing, and you may sense a little bit of trepidation or a somber mood because I am trying in this episode to share my story over the last 10 years, everything that what happened during my rugby career with my brain injuries, which resulted in a series of concussions that led up to a seizure on the training field and a bleed on the brain and forcing me to retire from the sport. Everything that happened during that, being totally honest about it, which I haven't been before, mainly because I'm slightly scared, or not slightly scared, I'm scared of potentially what people may think by sharing this, but I know that the right thing to do is always the right thing to do, and I'm going to just be totally honest. I'm just going to give you the facts. This isn't a story, this is what happened to me, and then importantly I'm going to share over the last 10 years what I've been understanding in terms of experimenting with looking at retraining and restoring my body's relationship with my breathing to help restore cerebral blood flow. I'll share with you results I've had from scans, most recently 10 years on, with some very positive results, which unfortunately isn't the case for most people when they've suffered multiple brain injuries. If you haven't listened to or watched the previous podcast in this series, it was 2 episodes ago. Part 1 was looking at the 60 years of research that is out there now. Unfortunately for me, I and people around me weren't aware of what the research was showing in the literature around breathing being one, a really important tool to assess how well the brain is recovering, but then 2, the best thing potentially that we have when we're very limited in what we can do physically because of the symptoms of our brain injury, the best possible thing that we can do to help improve cerebral blood flow. And if you've listened to part 1, you'll understand why that cerebral blood flow is so important. So this one I am going to just be as honest as I can, put my big boy pants on, and I'll share some detail that I haven't done before. So I thank you for listening. I thank you for your support. I know that this will help, or my hope for it is it will help people that are either going through it, or when they do go through it, or someone they know that's going through it, to be able to make better informed, educated decisions and choices about when I continue with my sports, particularly if they're contact, because there is stuff we know, it's in the literature, and I've got a real life example of myself, and I will also share a really lovely case study with a client that I've worked with one-on-one to help restore their brain function through training their breath with just some very simple exercises. Part 3 that's going to come after this, I'll go into much more detail about how to assess your own breathing or someone else's breathing if you're working with people or athletes, and then also what are some of the simple training exercises and techniques that are evidence-based, proven within the science and the literature, that to be able to improve cerebral blood flow to help improve the recovery of the brain based on the techniques from the Oxygen Advantage. Me and Patrick McKeown have recorded from the Oxygen Advantage. Me and him have recorded a separate podcast as well. We've been working on this together. I thank him for his work and his support with this. And I've got a few examples and a few case studies where we're putting this into practice and building up a little bit of proof to the theory that breathing really can be something and really should be something that needs to be part of our brain and concussion rehabilitation. We enter this world taking our first breath, and sadly we leave this place taking our last. And what I want to do with this podcast is to explore what happens between those breaths. I'm David Jackson, Jacko, and this is the Between Breaths podcast. There was a number of things I wish I knew about how I could use my breathing to improve my brain's recovery during that period back in 2013 in my life. But there are other things now as well that I wish I knew about that I'd love to share with you. And that is, one, a massive thank you to the podcast sponsors, HVMN. The ketones IQ that they provide, there is a lovely study done from April 2022 in a human neuroscience journal that shows that ketones can be supplemented during the acute phase of a brain injury to really help with neurodegeneration conditions. So this is something that I take now 10 years on that's really helping with sleep, really helping with focus. I take it in the morning. I sometimes take it before. I would take it before and potentially after my training, and certainly before I go to bed. And I'm really enjoying the benefits and literally feeling and better, sleeping better, being able to concentrate. And it's something that I wish, knowing that it's a direct fuel source for the brain, that when during an acute brain injury we are have a reduction in cerebral blood flow, and therefore we can't get adequate oxygen to the brain, therefore for glucose, well, blood oxygen, glucose for energy. The ketones are a substrate, are a natural fuel source, a clean fuel source that the brain can use directly. And during that acute phase, I wish that was something that I was able to benefit from, because it's going to help with our symptoms during that phase, and it's going to help us get into a better mental place, better sleeping state, to be able to then actually combine that with some of the breathing protocols that I would be suggesting for people. So whether you've had a brain injury or not, it's like I said, I'm 10 years on and functioning very well, and I'm feeling some very great benefits from the Ketone IQ from HVMN. So thank you to the sponsors of the podcast. You can get 20% discount off the Ketone IQ. We've got these little handy shots, which are great for travel, or there's the more concentrated, bigger bottles. You can get both of those and any of the other ketone products from hvmn.com. If you use the code JACKO, JACKO, all capitals, you get 20% off any of the products on your first order. If you click the link below, the link literally hvmn.com/JACKO, that will automatically apply the code for you. So check out the Ketone IQs from HVMN at hvmn.com/JACKO. So I'm making a sort of commitment and promise of this to be brave and be completely honest. And I'm going to be just literally sharing not a story, just the facts of what happened to me in the period leading up to and including the brain injury that I sustained. And then most importantly, most valuably, like what I have been doing in the last 10 years since then, and also sharing a little case study with a client that I've been working with. Now, the purpose of this is to not name names or people that are involved or anything like that. It's not to do with that. It's to do with understanding what has been going on in rugby, understanding what is still going on like other contact sports and within rugby, and that it's me trying to do my little part in that if I stay quiet and I don't say anything, that is not helping the cause. That is not helping others make better informed decisions based on some of experiences that I've had. And so there's some really key things that are important. And if you haven't listened to part one, I do recommend that you listen to part one, because I touch on some of the research that's shown around the importance of understanding when the brain is recovered to go back into a potential impact sport or contact sport, and that being symptom free, i.e. your headaches, your dizziness, your concentration, all those typical types of concussion symptoms, once they've resolved, if they've resolved in 7 days, it doesn't mean that the brain has recovered. So do reference back to episode 1. The trouble and the issues are around, there's some research that's shown that within just 3 concussions within somebody's career or within somebody's life, we see a significant decline in their cognitive function because of this cumulative build-up that happens. And the cumulative build-up is leading on to the major sort of worries for people like myself that have played contact sports, maybe you haven't played contact sports, but you just had a number of concussions within your life, and remembering a concussion doesn't mean you don't have to be out cold, you don't have to have a seizure like I did, you don't have to have a bleed on the brain. That is just a more traumatic brain injury. That the brain gets the sort of compounded effect. And when we are playing contact sports, there was a study done, it's sort of well known within the literature, but 2023, so earlier this year, Lennon citing that 1.5 to 3 times more likely to develop early onset of dementia when we're playing contact sports compared to when we haven't. And so that data is there. We need to make informed decisions about what we do, and I think it's most important to those that have been sustaining multiple concussions, because just 3 starts to really tip the needle in the wrong direction. And we've seen it within the NFL, within plenty of other contact sports, and rugby being an example of one of those. And I'll say at the start of this, like, the game has come a long way since I started and also since I finished, but there's still a long way to go. A really good example of this was George North in the Six Nations only just a few weeks ago, playing for Wales. A very, very long and worrying history of concussions and brain injuries for himself. Got knocked out in the game, and he was actually concussed, but was actually knocked out cold, and you could see that on the video replay. Millions of people saw it. The scary thing was, they watched the replay because there was a high shot, so they were looking at the where the impact was to give someone a yellow or red card, and you could see the replay, yet nobody took him off the field. He stayed on the field for a couple of minutes, which during that period, that is when we're in danger of second impact syndrome, where literally you can, and people have died from second impact syndrome. That is the major immediate worry. And there's people's jobs who's there to be looking out for these things, and he should have been taken off. It gets worse, because he came off to have a head injury assessment to assess in 10 minutes whether he'd been knocked out or not, even though we'd seen it on a video, we'd seen it on the replay, and he came off, thankfully, after a couple of minutes to be assessed. But then the really scary thing is, then he went back on, and it's just wrong. It's just wrong. There's no, it's wrong from a level of, like, you can see on the replay that he was knocked out, and it's also wrong that we know in the literature that if someone after 8 days is symptom free and we do an MRI scan on their brain, there's studies that show us that the brain is still injured. That's 8 days later. So having an assessment for 10 minutes, and whether it's depending on what his symptoms and brain function is like, is totally irrelevant. Not totally irrelevant, it's probably unfair, but it just shows that, like, assessing someone's cognitive function for 10 minutes on the side of the rugby field is not an adequate way to be able to tell whether the brain has been injured, and if they are safe to return back onto the field. So I'm just worried. I'm worried for people like him, and I was worried for myself, because I know what it's like. My story probably started when I was 16. I had my first concussion at an England trial. I didn't get taken off the field. I've got a video of it. I can't watch it anymore because it's on literally a VHS tape, so I don't know where we don't have VHS players anymore, do we? But it was videoed. I remember watching the video, and afterwards, I'm like, after I've been knocked out and concussed, I stay on the field. No one takes me off, and I'm literally wandering around, not knowing what I'm doing. My dad managed to get me off the field and took me to hospital. And that was my first visit to hospital, when at the age of 16, because of a concussion. And unfortunately, back then, it wasn't really thought much of concussions. And as I became a young adult and playing senior and professional rugby, when people got knocked out, we literally just thought it was funny. People couldn't remember their names. Someone couldn't remember that they'd broken up with their girlfriend, and the lads were trying to get them to ring their ex-girlfriend, and we just thought it was funny. We didn't know the impact of what was happening, because what we'd see is within a few days they were back to normal. Their symptoms resolved, but we weren't having MRI scans, we weren't having follow-up scans, and we weren't aware that actually that brain was still injured and still susceptible to injury. And what would happen is we'd go back and play, and then a few weeks or a few days or potentially even just a few months or even a few years later, we get another knockout, another concussion, and it's worse. It's compounded by what had happened before because we've potentially not allowed the brain to fully recover. We weren't being able to assess it effectively, and we didn't have any protocols to improve cerebral blood flow, which is the major thing that we need to do. So yeah, the culture around it at that time, and when I was 16 up to I then finished when I was 31, so there's a span of like 15 years there where I probably got taken to hospital 5 or 6 times from concussions, and what I now can see looking back is they progressively got worse. It was taking less to knock me out, and it was taking longer for me to recover from them, and I didn't appreciate that at the time, wasn't aware of that at the time. The medical staff that I was working with didn't know about the cumulative buildup of concussions. The first time I came across this concept of a cumulative buildup was when I saw my neurologist, who was the person that gave me the results of my MRI scan in December 2013. And the first thing they said was, you've got a cumulative build-up of all the previous concussions. She got my history up on the computer of the times I've been admitted to hospital through concussions, and she was very clear and very adamant that that's what it was, and that was what the case. And the penny really dropped for me there, and I understood immediately, like, that is exactly what's happened to me. Luckily, I can't remember what happened during that day when I had a seizure and a small bleed on the brain. I'm glad that you don't really remember those things. But what I'm told was that we were warming up in training, playing touch, and two of us on the same team just collided, trying to catch the same ball. Not a big impact. One of the lads said it looked funny. We're about to laugh as you hit the floor, but then started having a seizure, started having a fit. And the closest people put me in the recovery position, tried to ensure that got my tongue out of so I wasn't swallowing my tongue. And I got taken to hospital. I remember being in hospital. That's my first sort of memory. So it was certainly taking a lot less to knock me out, and the severity of the injury was becoming much worse. I initially was trying to get back to playing. It took me about 4 months of trying to get back to being able to get into physical exercise, but every time I did anything, it would trigger off all my symptoms, and it was a very difficult time. It was a very dark time. It's a very lonely time. It's a time with a lot of worry and very little hope for the future, because you're told to do nothing. Don't stimulate the brain. Sit in a dark room or lie in a dark room and don't stimulate the brain to let it recover. Now, what we know now is that actually that is not going to help restore cerebral blood flow. That is not going to help the brain actually normalize that cerebral blood flow, normalize blood gases, and actually get oxygen to the brain so it can recover. So even the advice we were getting was not only very limited, it's actually less helpful than what we can potentially do now, knowing what we know around how breathing can influence our cerebral blood flow, how concussions impact our breathing receptors, impact our therefore our respiratory rate, our internal CO2, so our body's relationship with carbon dioxide, all these things that I spoke about in episode 1. So I won't go over those again, but just so that we are aware, and you can reference back to episode 1 if you haven't done yet. It's not episode 1, it's part 1 of this series. Now, during that period between having my brain injury in the August and having my MRI scan in the December, I knew I wasn't right. Weeks turned into months, and I knew I wasn't right, and I was scared to go back on the rugby field. But I wasn't brave enough to put my hand up and say, Like, I didn't know anyone that retired due to concussions. But, I was scared. I was scared if I went back on the field, what would happen? And I don't think that's irrational. I think that's actually, looking back, is like, that is correct. But I didn't have the strength. I didn't have the courage. I wasn't brave enough to put my hand up and say, look, I'm done. Like, I put myself through more stress than I needed to, trying to get back, even though I didn't even want to. But I was scared of what people would think, mainly, if I gave up, if I quit, if I said, I'm scared, I don't want to play this sport anymore. And it wasn't that I didn't, I still love the sport. It isn't that. It's that I knew that for me, like, I couldn't afford to take another head knock. The neurologist then, with my MRI scan, showed me like a little black dot, which was a scar on the brain, and she said that the seizure was a sign of a bleed on the brain. It's like, seizure is like the brain like resetting. So I wasn't at all surprised that there was a bleed. And because this scan was 4 months later, it formed a scar. She said that within rugby, there are no rules in terms of, you could go and play again if you wanted to. But she said, if you were a professional boxer, this is the best way I can explain it to you. If you're a professional boxer, if you can't take a standing 10 count, then you have to go for an MRI scan. It's part of their rules, their laws. And if anything comes up on the MRI scan, like there was on mine, a bleed, a scar or anything, then their professional license is taken away from them. They're not allowed to box again professionally. And I said, look, that's enough. That's enough for me. Like, I'm happy. Like, you're taking, and bless her, she was, you could tell she was worried about saying, look, you got to finish playing rugby. And I was like, I'm so glad, I'm so scared, I'm so glad that you've said that you've told me. Basically, she said that, if you, if you go back on the field again now, like the significance of the cumulative build-up that you've had, you're really jeopardizing your long-term mental and brain health. Early onset of dementia, as we said, is potentially 1.5 to 3 times higher. And if you've had that many concussions, you put yourself in that worrying category. And also, worst case scenario, you go back and the brain hasn't recovered, and if it's worse again, like that you could die. That's what was said to me. And yeah, I don't want to. We don't want to. This is where it comes from. We don't want to see. And it's already happened. And one is too much, and we need to make sure that, like, yeah, well, not just if someone dies, but the some of the guys, and there's some very high profile rugby players you will have seen in some of the news, where you will have seen that they're already at 40, 50 years old, can't remember their children's names. Their early onset of dementia is kicking in, and it ruins their lives. It ruins them. And yeah, I'm sharing this to try and, yeah, because of what's happened to me. I just feel like it's been 10 years, and I need to be honest, and I need to put out there my side of what's happened, because I have a positive outcome. I've had a follow-up scan 10 years later, which, yeah, I'll share with you those results. I just want to give a little just example of one of the things that is a problem with brain injuries in sports, and particularly this danger of second impact syndrome. So probably around 2009, 2010, I was playing in a game where I took a knock to the head. I got concussed. I'd been concussed a number of times in my career before this, so I knew what it felt like. And I remember not knowing really what was going on, what I was doing. I made a lot of mistakes in the game. One of the teammates even was like, "Jacko, what are you doing?" And I was not. He could see that I was not right. At half time, I told the physio, I think I've been knocked out. I felt sick, which is a classic, sick, dizzy, don't really know where I am, classic signs of concussion. And they went behind me to do a Heimlich maneuver to try and make me be sick, and said, if you feel sick, if I make you sick, be sick. If you actually get it out, you'll feel better. It didn't work. I wasn't actually sick. And I went back out on the field. It's a prime example of, we can't let the player be in charge of whether they stay on or not, and that was with me even flagging, saying like, I think I've been knocked out. The real danger and trouble then is like having a second knock. What happened to me in that game, just as I literally can still remember it, I can remember turning to one of my mates, turning to him on the field and saying, "Oh, I actually feel better now. I think I'm back in the room almost." And he was like, "Great, Jacko. There's a scrum. It's our ball. Like the game's about to kick off." Like, I literally got the ball from that scrum. I can't remember anything. I've seen the video. I step, and someone still manages to tackle me because I've sort of I've almost sort of sidestepped them. They've ended up hitting me with their head. It was a head-on head collision, and it hit me on, I can't remember, but I've still got a displaced eye socket. Hit me right on the cheek. I had a triple fracture of the cheek and eye socket, and all I remember is being lying on the floor and opening my eyes, spitting blood into the physio's face, and apologising for spitting blood into their face. Now, that is as close as you're going to. That is I thank my lucky stars for that. I can still feel where my eye socket is displaced. It's a reminder that I believe that there are people or things, God, whatever you want to call it, looking after you. And I was exposed to second impact syndrome there, where you could have died. That is not a made-up story. That is fact. That is what happened. I'm very lucky. Very lucky. What happened? I had a triple fracture of my eye socket. I had to have an operation to have my cheekbone and eye bone reset. I was supposed to have a metal plate put in, but didn't need that in the end. And zero record, recollection, assessment, acknowledgement of a concussion, of a brain injury. On my medical records, even though I had two within the space of about half an hour on the rugby field, because there was a physical, obvious injury that needed to be addressed and sorted and operated on, that got sorted, and I'm very thankful and grateful that that's an amazing job that the doctors and the NHS do. That was sorted very quickly and done. Got taken to hospital in an ambulance, and that was sorted. But I was left then the lucky thing was I wasn't allowed to do any contact for 6 weeks until the bone had healed in my face and in my jaw and in my eye socket. So I wasn't exposed to contact for 6 weeks, which is a godsend, because there was no acknowledgement or assessment of my brain for brain injury. And back then, even if we did, it wouldn't have been adequate. But yeah, I remember looking back thinking, oh yeah, I felt horrendous doing. So I was doing like exercise, non-contact stuff to stay fit whilst my face healed. And I felt horrendous. I felt awful. And I thought, maybe it's just because I've been under general anaesthetic, that must be it. And it wasn't until looking back in 2013, maybe sort of 4 years later, 5 years later potentially, that I'd realised that, no, it was actually obvious. I'd had 2 significant concussions close together. I was lucky that I didn't die. That's why I felt horrendous, and it's just, yeah, I hate to think if I'd have not broken and had to have an operation, broken my face and jaw and eye socket, that, I could have been back playing again the following week, depending on what my symptoms were like. And what we know from the literature is that if your symptoms are okay, it doesn't mean the brain's recovered. It doesn't mean that the brain isn't still showing signs of injury when we have a scan. So, yeah, a real life example to just help people know, understand the importance, like I was lucky. So fortunately for me, but this isn't great because it's not the case for, it's actually not the case for any other of my former teammates that I've spoken to that have suffered similar things. I've had results from a brain scan 10 years later that show the scar on my brain has completely healed. It's not there anymore. I want to get the images. I've had the written reports that say that. I want to get the images to be able to show that as proof. I know people will believe me, but I want to get those images as proof. But it makes me feel sad because there's too many other people that it's not the case. It's not the case, and I don't feel like it's fair. It's not fair. Like I said in part 1, 60 years of research. 60 years ago, that in the literature, the scientists, they knew that concussions affected our breathing, and they know that breathing affects our cerebral blood flow. We know that cerebral blood flow is impaired during concussions and brain injuries and following them, and we know that it won't normalise on its own. Breathing won't normalise on its own. The blood gases won't stabilise on its own. So like the thing that I want to share and I want to help people with is what's the one thing that I've done that's different. I try to eat healthily, I try to get good sleep, etc. But those things can be very hard when mentally your brain is not getting adequate blood and oxygen supply. So it is harder to sleep, and sleep is really important. It is harder to make good choices, be motivated, not be depressed when your brain is lacking blood flow and oxygen. The one thing that I'm lucky, pure luck, that I came and stumbled across was breathing, and how breathing might be linked to some physical symptoms that I wasn't able to shake. For example, I had an ulcer on my tongue from where I must have bit my tongue during that impact. 5 years later, I still had an ulcer on my tongue, and it would come and go a little bit, but it would always be there. I had some other skin irritations, and the first point for me was that it seemed like my gut had been affected. And anyone that's aware of, I'm not the expert in brain-gut axis, but seeing some research that when you've had a brain injury, it will affect your gut microbiome, and that will potentially affect some, like I had, like skin disorders, ulcer, those types of things, and all sorts of other, all sorts of other things can happen. But for me, it was like skin issues and ulcers. And that led me into research showing that brain injuries or concussions not only affect your gut microbiome, but affect through the brain-gut axis, but affects our breathing, affects the respiratory centre. And that made sense. It's like the respiratory centre is in the brainstem. The brainstem is like the middle part of the brain, and the brain sort of almost like sits on top of it. And if it's getting rattled, then it's going to disrupt and the trauma to the head is going to affect those respiratory centres that govern our breathing, and our breathing governs our blood flow, or impacts our blood flow. When we breathe badly, we end up getting rid of too much carbon dioxide, and that helps, and it's not helpful, that makes our blood vessels constrict and reduces blood flow to the brain. We have reduced blood flow to the brain after a traumatic brain injury or a concussion because of the inflammation that happens during the injury. So the brain will become inflamed as part of the injury, and cerebral blood flow is reduced anyway. What we've seen from the research and literature is, and I had this first-hand experience myself, is that the respiratory centre affected, and it changes the rate at which you breathe, and which ultimately changes the amount of carbon dioxide that you start offloading. It changes the mechanics of how you breathe, so you become more inefficient with your breathing, and that leads us down a negative spiral of becoming more sensitive to carbon dioxide, not being able to tolerate carbon dioxide because you're getting rid of too much of it all the time, and that leaves us then in a state of constricted blood vessels, restricts blood flow to the brain, and keeps oxygen more tightly bound to hemoglobin in red blood cells. Carbon dioxide is the catalyst that allows oxygen to be released from red blood cells. I mean, that's something that Christian Bohr in 1904 discovered. So it's well over 100 years old. So this stuff is known. We're just piecing the puzzle together. I didn't come across this until probably I had my brain injury to August 2013. I didn't come across this to maybe 2018. It was probably 4 years later, and I asked myself the question, well, how well am I breathing? Have I got a problem with my breathing? I've had a brain injury, so there's some research showing that brain injuries affect your breathing. What's my breathing like? And I was lucky enough to come across Richie Norton. He put me in touch with Patrick McKeown's work. I got the book, spoke to Patrick on a previous podcast, and sort of fell in love with the guy and the work that he'd done. But I did the assessment on my breathing, which was those that have come across the Oxford Advantage know the BOLT score. It's a relaxed breath hold after exhalation to your first desire to breathe in. There's a whole series of videos on my YouTube channel, as well as a free Foundations of Breathing course on probreathwork.com. That's my website that you can have tutorials to know how to assess your own breathing. But essentially, it's the time delay between your last exhale and your next inhale, without any willpower being used. Just what's your body naturally happy to pause for before being triggered to breathe. And that trigger to breathe coming from an accumulation of carbon dioxide whilst you're pausing after that exhale. So it tells us how sensitive your respiratory centre is to carbon dioxide. We want that to be about 25 seconds, or 25 seconds is where the literature has showed that 25 seconds and above, you tend to be in good functional breathing, good relationship with carbon dioxide. Below 25 seconds is dysfunctional breathing traits and room for improvement in our chemosensitivity. Your biomechanics will probably be affected, and you'll probably have a distorted psychological relationship with the sensations of air hunger. Now, mine was about 8 or 9 seconds at a push. It was less than 10 seconds. Less than 10 seconds puts you in a category of being a sort of severe asthmatic potentially. And I was like, I didn't even realize that I've never had asthma. I didn't do this assessment because I thought I had a problem with my breathing. I did this assessment because I knew I'd had a brain injury, and I was reading research papers saying brain injuries might affect your breathing. So I'm a bit puzzled at this point, going like, I've always been very fit. By then I'd made a recovery. I was running like a 20-minute 5K, which is not a world record, but it's a reasonable pace. Like, I felt fit. But something in me felt like the handbrake was slightly on. I felt like something was slightly not right going on in the background. And understanding that we breathe 20-odd thousand times a day, I started to come to this belief and this theory and this awareness that, yeah, maybe my breathing has been affected. And this BOLT score, at this point, I don't really fully understand what it is, but I'm like, that's telling me that my breathing's really bad. It's like, well, how are you supposed to breathe? And what's good breathing supposed to feel like? So I couldn't answer those questions, so I went down this rabbit hole, so to speak. And it's probably a whole other story into like the Oxygen Advantage, and I did the instructor training with Patrick McKeer, and he taught me. I learned from him, and I was doing that for my own benefit. I guess fell in love with the process, the effect it had, and I was noticing things like my sleep, things like my concentration, things like my focus, being able to manage my mood and my states. Like I've never had a problem with getting excited and upbeat about things, but after my brain injury, and you can ask my wife about this because it's the one thing that she would say on that the lows. I didn't manage the lows well, and I would have bigger lows, and I think one thing was that I didn't have, and wasn't aware of how my breathing affected my nervous system and affected things like sort of the depression, anxiety side of things, and they are some of the symptoms of brain injuries, but they're also the symptoms of being very sensitive to carbon dioxide, and I basically have those two things combined, and those two things are linked together for those of us that have had brain injuries. So bear in mind, this was about 4 years after my brain injury, when, unaware of my breathing, it felt fine. I started trying initially can I nasal breathe whilst going on my run? And no, I couldn't. Could I nasal breathe at night? No. I tried taping my mouth and I couldn't keep the tape on. I'd just rip it off or it'd fall off. My brain wasn't happy keeping my mouth closed. Even when I was sleeping, it certainly wasn't happy keeping my mouth closed when I was exercising. And I'd become very maladapted to breathing. And it was something that then for me took a couple of years to retrain all different dynamics or dimensions of the breathing, the psychological relationship with the air hunger, with the breath hold techniques that we do with the Oxygen Advantage, the mechanics of how I breathe. It's still an ongoing process. Rib cage alignment, rib cage expansion, feeling the diaphragm. What's diaphragmatic breathing look like? And restoring that or recalibrating my body and brain's relationship, that chemosensitivity with carbon dioxide. That was a long process because I made a lot of mistakes along the way. I tried to push things too hard, and actually what I've seen now and seen with myself, and then with some clients that I've worked with one-on-one that have had brain injuries and concussions, is that some very, very simple things help to improve that body's relationship with carbon dioxide. And that's the most important thing in terms of restoring a balance of carbon dioxide within the blood, helps blood vessels open, helps improve cerebral blood flow, and helps oxygen be released from the blood. So that's the major thing to focus on for us when we're trying to help use breathing as a tool to improve our brain's recovery from an injury. It's using breathing and the body's relationship with carbon dioxide to help improve and restore cerebral blood flow. It's also part of that is going to be slowing down our breathing and doing things like extending our exhalations to help keep a little bit more carbon dioxide in, because you breathe out slower than your body wants to, so you're not getting rid of carbon dioxide as quickly. That has an important benefit on our vagal tone and our autonomic nervous system. The body after a brain injury is in a state of shock, of stress, of fight or flight, of sympathetic tone. And I haven't got any data to back this up, but I'd suggest that when our breathing keeps us in that state, that literally years later, you can be still dominated by that fight or flight response. I have spoken, Dr. Cobb from Z Health Performance is a little bit of a specialist in this area, and he had suggested to me that, you could have a brain injury and years later your breathing will still be off, and years later your heart rate variability, your autonomic nervous system will be disrupted still and dysregulated. And I'd certainly experienced that. So by restoring our brain's relationship with carbon dioxide, we help improve cerebral blood flow, we help improve oxygen delivery to the brain so it can recover. But as part of that process, the breathing exercises that we will be doing, part of that will be slowing down our breathing rate, which helps slow down our heart rate and slowing down our exhalations can help to improve vagal tone, help to improve autonomic nervous system function. So we get this balance, recalibrating of the nervous system and de-stressing, as well as readdressing that balance of blood gases within the body that allows then the brain the oxygen and blood supply that it needs to recover. So what does that look like in practice? I thought I would share a lovely case study that I've got from a non-sporting concussion and injury from a retired individual in their, I believe, in their 70s, where they'd had a concussion and it happened 18 months before they came to see me. And I will go into detail in a follow-up blog and podcast episode around the full assessments and all of the exercises that we would program for somebody. So that's going to come as well, but I'll give you some detail within this case study of what we did and what actually happened. So on day one, this individual was completely unaware that their breathing had been affected. They were very lucky that a private GP that I work with, Dr. Sally Bell, some of you will know, he was seeing her privately. She's been trained, I've actually trained her in the Oxygen Advantage, so she is able to look at someone's breathing and be able to tell whether they might benefit from seeing someone like myself. So she referred him on to me. We did all our sessions via Zoom, so we haven't even met in person, and they were open to look at it as something that might be able to help, but they had no idea there was anything wrong with their breathing. Day one, how does your breathing feel? Feels fine. Okay, let's do some assessments. So we did a very simple respiratory rate. We put one hand on the upper chest, one hand on just below the sternum, and just feel the breath moving. Which hand is moving? What direction is the breath moving in? Is it vertical? Is it expanding out to the sides? And I'm visually watching. They're counting their breaths. We do it over 30 seconds so that we don't slow down things too much, and we multiply the number by 2 to give a respiratory rate. So in 30 seconds, breathing rate was 12. That meant in a minute, breathing rate was 24 breaths per minute. That's fast. That's twice as much as what we probably want them to be at. When we're breathing that fast, it's very difficult for the mechanics to be good because we don't have time to take a nice diaphragmatic breath. So visually, the chest was just pounding up and down 24 times in a minute. Very easy visually to see, and something that certainly needed to be addressed, and something that wasn't going to normalize on its own. It will not just calm itself down. It gets stuck in that state. That type of fast breathing rate is also upregulating for the nervous system. It will keep the individual in a state of sympathetic dominance, which is not going to be good for the restorative processes that need to happen as well. Bolt score, so how sensitive the individual was to carbon dioxide accumulating after a normal exhale before that first desire to breathe in after that normal exhale, was 3 seconds. So that is extremely low Bolt score, very sensitive to carbon dioxide. Now, I'm very pleased to say that they hadn't had any scans, so we don't have any scans to go by, but other things that we could measure would be heart rate variability, but he didn't have any technology for that. But the Bolt score does give us an indication of one's heart rate variability because the breathing is related into the heart rate and the autonomic nervous system. So if the Bolt score is very low, it's very likely that heart rate variability is low as well. You're not going to have a low Bolt score, but really great heart rate variability. So within 6 weeks, we'd done 3 sessions across 6 weeks, where I'll explain what we did, but the results being that Bolt score came up to 9 seconds, which is still really low, but it's tripled from 3, which is significant. And respiratory rate is now 13 breaths per minute, just at normal, without doing any breathing exercise. For last session I did with him, first thing we did before we did anything, take the respiratory rate. We didn't do any breathing exercise or practice. 13 breaths per minute. How does that individual feel? He feels calm. He feels he's got energy. sleeps all the way through at night now, which wasn't happening before, can actually go out walking in the countryside, and has been restored his ability to enjoy his life. And there's still some way to go, because it's going to carry on improving. When that BOLT score goes from 9 up to the teens and up to 20, it's going to feel significantly different again. But it's already been, in the case of just like 6 weeks, quite a life-changing process. And that, to reiterate, that injury they sustained happened 18 months before they'd seen me. So it's not in the acute phase. 18 months has gone by, and still we can come in and we can assess and we can make changes and we can improve. What were some of the things that we did? 2 very simple exercises. One, with the Oxygen Advantage, we call it many short breath holds. Pausing after an exhale for about normally 3, 4 or 5 seconds. But when we're very, very sensitive to carbon dioxide and our BOLT score is very low, we only really want to do it to half of someone's BOLT score. So his BOLT score was like 3 seconds. So we were only pausing for about 1.5 seconds. And then take 2 breaths. At the end of the second exhale, pause. Breathe in, breathe out. Second breath, breathe in, breathe out, pause. 2 breaths, pause. And gradually build up that time that pause is comfortable. It helps restore the balance of carbon dioxide in the body. The pause, you're not breathing the carbon dioxide out, so you're keeping a little bit inside and asking the body just to change its relationship with carbon dioxide. Psychologically, just being comfortable with, oh, when I pause, I do feel a subtle sense of air hunger or feeling of breathing. That's good, that's carbon dioxide. We want you to get comfortable with that. The pause is also just to slow down the total breathing cycle. So that's allowing the nervous system to calm down a little bit as well. And then the other exercise that works really great is quietening the breathing and extending the exhalations with a hum. Humming naturally extends our exhalation, but also the vibrations innervate the vagus nerve, and the vagus nerve runs, longest nerve in the body, runs from the neck and comes through the voice box, down through the diaphragm. So when you're diaphragmatic breathing, you're also innervating it, and goes and visits all of the major internal organs. It sends 80% of its information back up to the brain, so it's communicating to the brain what's going on inside, back up to the brain. It's the key player in autonomic nervous system regulation. So by slowing down our exhales, it responds positively to carbon dioxide, the vagus nerve as well. And by humming, we're slowing down the exhales. We're keeping a little bit more carbon dioxide in because we're getting rid of it at a slower rate than we want to when we slow those exhales down. And the humming is nice and relaxing. And what we're trying to get is a sense of relaxation as we do the exhalation. A gentle, quiet breath in. Humming on the way out. Generating a sense of relaxation, some soft sense of air hunger, which is just a sign that carbon dioxide is just elevating and you're just getting used to it. What we're then starting to see is that relaxation response kicking in. We'd notice saliva building up in the mouth. Now, someone that's under a lot of stress, whether they realise it or not, but in terms of their nervous system and their bad breathing, it can take a couple of sessions where we have to work on that. The mouth still feels quite dry. The nervous system is finding it hard to down-regulate and actually shift over from that sympathetic fight or flight state into the relaxation, rest, digest, parasympathetic. The rest, digest, relaxation response, the saliva is a physical sign of that. So if this is you wanting to know whether you're doing it right, or are you creating that shift, when you're starting to extend those exhalations, making sure you feel like you're staying relaxed and your inhales are soft and quiet and nice and relaxed. When you start to have a little swallow and notice, we have saliva building up, that's a sign that your body is getting into that state of rest, digest and restore, and that's when a lot of the restorative processes can take place. and your nervous system is down-regulating. That's going to help with reducing inflammation, that's going to help with the brain's recovery, and then you're also slowing down your breathing and keeping a little bit more carbon dioxide inside, and that's then allowing cerebral blood flow to improve, as well as oxygen delivery to the brain and the tissues improve as well. So that's a client's example. So it's not just me as one example where I've managed to heal, or my brain has healed itself over a 10-year period. An example with a client where we are making significant change to how they feel and how they function, and then also their breathing assessments. And he, unlike me, doesn't have MRI scans before and afterwards to compare, but we would be expecting to see some really positive changes within that. And the reality is, we can't be scanning everyone's brain all the time. We can't expose them to that. The cost will be one, but also we can't expose them to that level constantly of potential radiation. And you know, assessing the breathing, assessing heart rate variability are going to be tools that I'll talk later in the final of this 3-part series, where they become the tools to assess, and they also become the tools to rehabilitate and help the brain to recover. And so I really hope this has been helpful. Been had quite a lot of messages and emails from people from the first in this series, where you or someone you know is going through the brain rehabilitation and brain recovery from a brain injury or a concussion. There's also been someone around saying it's not necessarily a brain injury they've had, but they've got a brain tumour, and is there things that we can do? And I hope that this is helpful. I hope it's presented in a way that is simple enough that you can understand, that it's rational, that it makes sense, and you can start to apply some of these very simple breathing techniques and exercises to help improve your brain's recovery and improve the way that you feel and the way that you function, and so you can get back to being the best version of yourself and ultimately enjoy what life we have left ahead of us. I know that there'll be a number of people watching this that maybe you've been sent it, or if you know someone, I'd love you to share it with them if this would be beneficial to them. You may be someone that works with sports people in contact sports. I am putting together a webinar that I will host, where I will go through and share and outline all of the research that points us in the direction of using breathing and heart rate variability as a better tool for assessing a brain's recovery, as well as a full set of protocols to follow if we're working with an individual or within a team to be able to better assess them and better help their brain recover from injuries, and importantly have better assessments to know when they are fully recovered to be able to go back into their sport. So if you are someone that's working in sports or working with people suffering from brain injuries, concussions, and you would be interested in that, I'd love to hear from you. So do get in touch. My email is david.jackson@oxygenadvantage.com. I'll make sure the link, my email, is in the show notes as well. Please do share this if you feel that it will be helpful and beneficial to other people. And thank you for your support. I hope it was. I hope you can take it for what it was. It's me trying to be honest about what happened to me, and me trying to share the positive outcomes that I've managed to be lucky enough to come across, and just wanting to get that out there to the people that need it most. And I know that there is a lot of you and a lot of them out there. So, you know, whether it's been 18 months or whether it's been 18 years, I would be adamant that assessing your breathing and improving your breathing will be beneficial for your brain and your brain's health, and you will notice the differences. So I look forward to sharing that in the final in this 3-part series, a little bit more detail on those protocols, as well as inviting you to a online webinar that I'll be doing to be able to share that information in detail and help equip you to be able to assess your own or somebody else's breathing and be able to use it as a tool to be able to help improve, importantly, the cerebral blood flow and therefore ultimately the brain's recovery. So do keep an eye out for that. And I'm sure if you keep an eye on that and listen to the podcast or on social media, on Instagram, jacko.david.jackson, you will see announcements for that then. But yeah, do get in touch. Let me know if this has been helpful, if this has been interesting, and if there's people that you want to share it with. Please do share it with them. I know that it will be, and hope that it will be beneficial for them. So a slightly more somber mood in this episode, but hopefully you understand why. Thank you for your support. You've been great. I've been trying to be as honest as I can be. Until next time, keep it nasal.